Thank you for the invite to the organizers. I appreciate being back speaking at the Wavefront Congress. It's one of my favorite meetings and will remain so for a long time, I hope. I do have some disclosures. The University of Houston holds patents on some visual image quality metrics, objective refraction, and wavefront guided optical corrections, and I consult for waveguide. What I'm reporting today is primarily from my work that's been supported by NIH over the years. So my journey began a long time ago with RK, and I was convinced that right away that it wasn't optically the best way to go for correcting the refractive errors of the eye. And there's several reasons for it. To know where rays of light will go, we need to know the physical shape of each optical surface point by point and the index difference at each optical surface and the size of the entrance pupil and apply Snell's law. Rays of light go where they go. And just to remind the clinicians that corneal first surface wavefront maps don't tell you where light's going. So in the late 80s, we extracted actual elevations from the corneal topography maps. And what I want to illustrate here is that if you just look at the elevation map on the left, you can even see some of the RK pattern and the actual physical shape of the cornea. And if you subtract the sphere and cylinder from the underlying elevations, you can clearly see the RK pattern. As a result, as the pupil got larger, there were a lot of optical complaints. Now, looking at the fovea area and correcting the foveal area is a much easier problem than trying to correct the optics over the entire retina. So what we want to do is have good optical quality in the foveal area, and that's what we've primarily focused on as clinicians over the years. A healthy, normal eye is well corrected in this area with sphere and cylinder, as long as they don't have a lot of higher order aberrations. But since we emphasize this area, we're ignoring a lot of other factors, and I'd like to emphasize that at this point. The foveal area has less than 0.02% of the retinal area. It contains less than 0.3 of the total cones for our photopic vision. Non-foveal areas are critical for motor control, ocular growth, which controls hematropization and essentially myopia control. Essential for brain maturation, navigation, and there's a very long list. So I would encourage people to start thinking broader than just foveal corrections. So my advice at the time with RK and as refractive surgery came in was to advise everyone that the first goal of any new correction design for the typical normal eye's foveal vision should be to correct the spheral cylindrical errors for the fovea without inducing new higher order aberrations for any retinal location. I would argue we haven't done a great job of that. So I'll focus today on retinal quality, on the retinal image quality, and talking about why it's not the same as visual image quality, the power of using objective visual image quality metrics clinically is to provide value to the patient and clinicians. And note that economically powerful industries are beginning to really pay attention and what I believe the next steps are for such metrics. Okay, retinal image quality is not the same as visual image quality. Most people probably in this group understand it, but for those that may not be aware of it and are new to the area, metrics of retinal image quality define how well the optical components of the eye form an image on the retina. Optimizing retinal image quality through large pupils and adaptive optical systems is critical for seeing microscopic detail of the retina, and particularly in diseased eye. And I show an image from Steve Burns's lab, and there's many, many labs across the world that are doing this now, and many departments of ophthalmology. But as you can see microaneurysms and the blood flow through them easily. However, visual image quality metrics incorporate knowledge of how the visual system processes a retinal image. And in broad strokes, you use retinal image quality, and you limit the whole visual system is limited by the sampling of the photoreceptors. And then you have neural processing, generally used in these metrics as a contrast sensitivity function. And then finally, you have how one perceives. And to date, there's not a whole lot in the metrics as to how we perceive, other than the first three steps above. Okay, so we can easily measure retinal image quality, which is the first step in visual image quality metrics, with modern clinical state-of-the-art ophthalmic wavefront sensors. Sampling limit on the retina, this is a slide courtesy of Austin Roida. You can see if you put a 20/5 letter E on the retina and ask which photoreceptors are being stimulated in the right panel, you can see that there's not enough information to correctly identify the letter E from sampling. You need at least one photo, to meet the Nyquist sampling limit, you need at least one photoreceptor for each dark and light stripe in a letter E. And that fundamentally limits foveal sampling limits acuity to approximately 20/8. A lot of people use 20/10, but you are approaching a limit, and obviously there's a lot of biological variation. Now, as to the neural contrast sensitivity function, Gareth Hastings in my lab did a lot of work on this. And as you can see, as a function of spatial frequency and brightness over here, that the contrast sensitivity function varies a lot. But any of these functions can be placed into a visual image quality metric. And it also varies with age. The older you get, the less contrast sensitivity. But all of these can be easily fed into metrics. As to how we perceive, that's a very interesting question by itself. And most people nowadays believe that we compare the image on the retina to our experience over time. And we come to the conclusion quickly from our own experience about what the object is. And in this image, a lot of people will see a skull as opposed to a lady sitting at a vanity mirror, a big oval vanity mirror with perfume bottles. But of course, if you get rid of the higher spatial frequencies, let's say with a half Doppler defocus, the only thing you can see is the skull. So what we perceive is a very complex thing and has a lot to do with our visual experience over time. So I'm going to talk about one of the visual image quality metrics to give you an idea of how these are actually utilized. And I'll use the visual Stroll ratio. And there's several of them, and there's many laboratories that have worked on this problem. And it's the combined effort of a lot of people that have gone into these. And more need to be developed, and these need to be refined. But to give you a taste, the visual, was there a question there? Okay. The visual Stroll ratio is the integration of the point spread function. I'm using the spatial domain visual Stroll ratio. It is the integration of the point spread function as measured for the pupil size of interest, integrated with the neural transfer function, represented by the contrast sensitivity function, divided by what a diffraction limited point spread function would be, also weighted by the neural contrast sensitivity function, right? And given that formula, you can see that the ratio varies from 0 worst to 1 best. A perfect optical system that's equivalent to a diffraction limited one. And the functions we've used to date have dated back to Campbell and Green's study in 1965 for the photopic curve. But as I showed you in the slide previous, we now have neural contrast sensitivity as a function of not only luminance level, but also age. All of these can be fed into these metrics. Now, traditionally out there in the field, we've used RMS wavefront error, and I want to illustrate why this is as interesting as it is, and it somewhat correlates with the visual performance. But if we really want to do it right, you have to weight it by the contributions of the neural system, and I'll try to illustrate that in the next slide. So we can divide it all up by different components of the Zernike polynomial. And that's very nice because the Zernike polynomial is orthogonal. And one would like to think that each of these aberrations affect vision the same way. But that's not true. I have weighted each of these. I don't know why my slides keep advancing without touching anything, but they do. If I put 0.25 microns of RMS wavefront error in each of these aberrations in the Zernike tree, you can see that different aberrations affect visual performance differently. And I note for the clinicians, this is less than a quarter diopter if the same error was weighted into defocus alone or spherical error. And the letter size here is 24. Now, if you use the visual Strel ratio. Here I've weighted it for a 3mm pupil. There's advantages to that. If we have time, I'll go into it. But you can see that the correlations vary quite nicely with what you see on the screen. So while the visual Strel ratio is quite nice, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than RMS wavefront error. RMS wavefront error could not differentiate acuity changes of over 2 lines. But if you plot the same data on the visual Strel ratio, you'll see that the correlation is quite high, accounting for about 80% of the variance. All right, the power of using objective visual inequality metrics. If there's a takeaway slide, the next one's probably it in terms of why I think it's so important for the ophthalmic community to start using these metrics for a whole variety of reasons. It provides value to patients and clinicians. So what are some of these? It's objective, it's not subjective. Acuity is notoriously bad because high contrast acuity, it is very forgiving, I'll put it that way. Has better sensitivity and specificity than high contrast acuity. Better reflects patients' observations when they're unhappy. For the refractive surgeons, they're all aware of wanting that patient to walk out happy. And when a patient says, yeah, I can see 20/20, but it's not as good as it used to be, you're dealing with a patient that has a level of dissatisfaction. Use design optical corrections of varying complexity to meet patients' needs. Used to predict advantages and disadvantages of different correction designs before you even build them. Used to evaluate success of whatever strategy that's been developed. Was the goal achieved and how well? And used to objectively compare different modes of correction. So as part of the patient-doctor decision process on how to proceed. And the list goes on and on. And I'll give you some examples.
Ray, sorry for interrupting. You only have a 30-second left. If you could wrap it
30
up.
30 seconds?
Yeah.
Whoa. Well,
Time fast. Time flies fast. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Gin Young. I'll just point out a couple of these cases then, and then I'm sure I'm willing to make all my slides available to everybody. All right, so before and after refractive surgery, patient's unhappy. You use a visual image quality metric. You can detect 6 changes in image quality before a line of acuity is lost. Modeling nowadays is incredible to show exactly how a person, this is a spheral cylindrical coordinate system, sphere up and down, cylinder going out, axis going around. But notice there's only one location for a good correction for any one eye, and you use the metric to find it. Patients actually prefer a objective refraction using the VSX metric. Standards are out there and published. For the highly aberrated eye, it's incredible. If you do a metric-derived correction for them and compare it to what they're wearing, you can improve their acuity. It's not great for keratoconic, just doing a spheral cylindrical correction. And the reason is there's multiple places where a highly aberrated eye can be corrected, not just one. And you need to find the best one if you're going to limit the sphere cylinder. And that's illustrated in a modeling paper that's just now being accepted for publication. You can see that there's zones separated by diopters if you're just using sphere and cyl and keratoconic eyes. And of course, you can use them to design wavefront guided corrections. Even the best scleral lens and the keratoconic doesn't spheral cylindrical scleral lens doesn't do all keratoconics the best, but a wavefront guided lens does much better. All right, and I'll just stop after this next slide, just to point out that industry is really interested in this stuff now. Apple's already has a team in recruiting members from NASA and away from academia for their virtual reality and their augmented reality work. And those of us in the vision community got this email from Facebook just recently saying, come join us. We got to figure out what to do and how to build things to include large fields of view that are necessary for augmented reality and virtual reality. All right, and the final step that I'd like to share, if Gideon will let me.
Yeah, very, very quickly, 10 seconds.
Okay. This is my last slide. A combined wavefront sensor corneal topographer specifically using the line of sight. Most people don't use the line of sight, capable of evaluating visual image quality for any correction, not only for fovea vision, but for any field of view. OCT measurements of the anterior surface of the eye over the cornea and conjunctiva to better understand biomechanics and optical surface structures. Improve visual image quality metrics that account not only what I've talked about today, but processing, other processes such as binocular vision. Young's group's working on that nicely. And I'd like to see 3D nanoprinting of wavefront guided contact lenses in the office. Improve wavefront guided surgery respecting biomechanics of each eye. That's available if you build the right equipment. And establish visual image quality metrics for all fields of view, not just the focus. Thank you.